Good afternoon, certainly to everyone who's attending today. It's really a thrill and a privilege to be joined today by Senator Sam Nunn and Dr. William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense to President Bill Clinton. Today is actually very fitting that we're really quite dependent on technology. And Senator Nunn was sharing with a group of us at lunch today that Dr. Perry, perhaps more than any his predecessors, infused technology into defense and security world in ways that we're really seeing in dramatic leaps and bounds today. So I think it's fitting that we're bringing him in using some of this technology. It's also fitting in this world that we live in today that we would have a major irony to be able to introduce into any event. And of course, today we're going to have a very exciting lecture about issues related to nuclear proliferation and national security. And at the same time, our university, like many others in the last few days, particularly the last 2 days, has had hackers hitting us with something called the denial of service, if anyone's familiar with that. Basically, it kind of chokes your internet. And so we have a really very sophisticated IT team that's done some wonderful work in the area, and hopefully we'll be fine. But there's a decent chance that right in the middle of something just prophetic that Dr. Perry is saying, that he'll drop off because of these attacks. And so we have a backup plan. If that occurs, we're just going to switch to old-fashioned technology and bring him up via audio if that were to occur as well. So I just wanted to give you all a heads up that if it happens, we're being attacked, but do not panic, please. So today we're honored to welcome Senator Nunn to the University of Georgia and the Richard B. Russell Special Collections Libraries, where obviously we have a room today full of students, faculty, alumni, and special guests who are looking forward to this talk. And certainly among those guests looking very forward to this talk today is our President, Jerry Moorhead, who's joining us today in the front row. So thank you, President Moorhead, for joining us today. Let me also make you aware that we're pleased to welcome students and faculty who are hopefully joining us from Georgia Tech, home to the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And they're joining us today by watching today's program through the same video technology that's being used to bring in Dr. Perry from Northern California as well. And so we would certainly encourage them to join us during the question and answer period. And we have no concerns at all that they will be very comfortable tweeting their questions to Senator Nunn and Dr. Perry using the hashtag UGA Charter 16. And we know they'll enjoy typing in UGA as well. With all of that now introduced, and hopefully everything is working so far, let me say a quick word about the lecture series that really marks this special occasion today. So this lecture series is actually named for the charter that created the University of Georgia way back in 1785. Written chiefly by Abraham Baldwin, the charter really put to paper, principles that were really very, very unconventional for the time. And those principles included, first, the notion that an educated citizenry is essential to good government. Second, that government has a responsibility to educate its citizens. And third, all people, and not just the privileged few, are entitled to that education. And by endorsing these principles, the Georgia General Assembly made UGA the first state-chartered university and the birthplace, frankly, of public higher education in the United States of America. The charter lecture truly embraces a noble idea that it's the responsibility of the university to actually encourage an open dialogue about very important issues. And I think we'll all agree that today's discussion certainly represents an issue worth discussing and thinking about in insightful ways. So to introduce our speakers today, we are very privileged to have one of our most accomplished and respected international scholars to do the honors for today. Dr. Loch Johnson is both a Regents professor and a MEX professor at the University of Georgia. He has authored or edited 30 books and more than 200 articles on U.S. national security himself. He is truly the ideal person to moderate today's events, both for his knowledge in this area, frankly, as well as just how fun he is to have moderate event as well. So on that note, Dr. Johnson, I'll invite you up here to introduce the show today.
Thank you. I think I'll just do it from right here, but I thank you for your kind words. And President Moorhead, always wonderful to see you. And how many distinguished people we have from town, too. We're glad to see you on campus. I'd like to give a special welcome to the students from Georgia Tech who are here electronically at any rate, I'm told. You know, we may disagree with you on one Saturday each fall, but in Athens we have the highest admiration for Georgia Tech, and we're honored that you're with us today. This is a special day at the University of Georgia. When I think of the top lawmakers that this state has produced over the decades, I think of Sam Nunn, Richard Russell, and Carl Vinson. And when I think of the most effective secretaries of defense we've had over the years, I think of Bill Perry, Harold Brown, Bob Gates, and Ash Carter. For us to have today both Senator Nunn and Secretary Perry on the same program is an abundance of riches for which we are grateful. Also, in the middle of this madcap presidential election season, it's great to be able to take a break and think of something a little bit lighter, such as, are we going to blow up the planet with nuclear weapons? Actually, there are few subjects as important as preventing nuclear catastrophe in an age of terrorism, which is the title of our charter lecture today, and there are no two better people in this country to address this topic. Sam Nunn, as you know, represented this state in the U.S. Senate from 1972 to 1996, rising to the chairmanship of the prestigious Armed Services Committee, which he led with great distinction. Among his many achievements was a major reorganization of the Department of Defense and passage in 1991 of the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which for more than 2 decades assisted the Russians in securing their nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, so-called MBC weapons, and also to destroy that country's excess WMD inventory. Currently, Sam Nunn is a distinguished professor at the School of International Affairs that bears his name, and he serves on various boards, including the Coca-Cola Company. He attended Georgia Tech, Emory, and Emory Law, where he graduated with honors. He also served in the U.S. Coast Guard. For several years now, he has been co-chair and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI, a nonpartisan, I love that word, nonpartisan, where did that go? A nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to prevent the use and spread of MBC weapons. Bill Perry, who joins us today on the big screen, I'm hoping the screen works, though I've been told it may not, from Stanford University, where he is Professor Emeritus. He served as Secretary of Defense from 1994 to 1997. He earned undergraduate degrees, both a BA and a master's degree at Stanford University, and went on to get a PhD in mathematics from Penn State. Secretary Perry, Dr. Perry, has served in the U.S. Army and is on many boards, including Bell Labs. In 1997, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Secretary Perry has an interesting new book out, which I recommend all of you. It's called My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. Very fascinating study of the topic. And I hope he's able to tell us more about it as we proceed today. Gentlemen, I welcome you both. What a pity that Dean Rusk is not here with us today. He admired both of you very much. And as you know, he was someone who was deeply concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons. He liked to point out, though, that these weapons have not been used since 1945. And if you count up to today, that would be 71 years. So the first question I would pose to Senator Nunn and to Secretary Perry is, are we likely to experience another 71 years without a nuclear weapon being used in anger?
I would say in answer to that, I hope so, and I pray that's the case. The odds are against it, though, because we've gone since Hiroshima and Nagasaki without a nuclear weapon being used, but we primarily had 2 very large nuclear powers. And of course we had Britain, France, and China that came along later, but we were in alliances that pretty much responded to each other. Today it's a much more complicated equation with 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, including most notably India and Pakistan, where probably the dangers are as great as anywhere in the world. And then you've got North Korea and Iran that are aspiring to nuclear programs, and you've got several other countries that could develop those weapons. By and large, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has done better than most people thought. It was entered into in 1968, and the deal was that the countries with nuclear weapons would step by step get rid of them over a period of time. Countries without nuclear weapons would not develop them. That treaty has been implemented with a considerable degree of success, although there are a lot of holes in it. But the thing I worry about a great deal is not simply a nuclear use by a state, but I think we're in a new era where states no longer have the control or monopoly on nuclear weapons or material or know-how. So we could face a perfect storm there, and my organization, which Bill Perry has been very much a part of, has focused on trying to protect nuclear material. The best way to keep nuclear terrorism from occurring is to keep the materials out of their hands. So we got a lot of work to do. Certainly the fact that we went through so many years of the Cold War without nuclear weapons is very encouraging. I think to our military and to the Soviet military, we were professional, we were diligent, we were careful, we did a lot of things right, but we had a lot of close calls. Bill Perry will be able to tell you about that. And I would say that, yes, it was a very professional effort on both sides to prevent war of any kind, which could have gone into a nuclear war, but also we were extremely fortunate. The chances of the next 50 years being that fortunate with 9 nuclear countries and growing, I would say, are much less than we would like. So we're all about trying to reduce nuclear risk. We're fortunate to have Bill Perry with us today. I'll just say a couple of words about him, and then we'll be primarily hearing from him. But I'll say that Bill Perry has the highest A to E ratio of any public servant I've ever known. A standing for accomplishments, and E standing for ego. I've never known anyone like that. We say he is terminally and critically modest. So he will not be bragging, but of the technology, we have Arnold Pernaro, a Georgia graduate who was my chief of staff, sitting here, and he will acknowledge that for the last 20 years and continuing today, most of the cutting edge technology we have in our military was developed when Bill Perry was head of research and development back in the late 70s, and developed also when he was Secretary of Defense and Deputy. So we're delighted to have him. He's a friend, he's a partner, and to me, he's an American hero.
The only 2 modest people I've ever met in Washington, D.C. are Sam Nunn and Bill Perry, I think. Dr. Perry, we're so glad to have you with us. What do you think of the prospects for not using these weapons in anger over the next 71 years or so?
Well, let me first say how honored I am to be participating in this charter lecture along with a great American, Senator Nunn. But to answer your question, I believe that the likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is higher than it was during the Cold War. You say that again. The prospect of a nuclear catastrophe today is actually higher than it was during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we were concerned much about a surprise attack from the Soviet Union, what we called a bolt out of the blue. In retrospect, that was a greatly exaggerated concern, but there were 2 very real concerns for a nuclear catastrophe during the Cold War. One of them was we have an accidental nuclear war. We had at least 3 instances in the United States where we had false alarms that could have triggered the nuclear war, but happily did not. And we know at least of 2 in the Soviet Union. So in one of those false alarms, I personally participated, and it made a very deep impression on me. I got a call at 3 o'clock in the morning from the watch officer to North American Air Defense Command, and the general got right to the point. He told me that his computers were showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought that the end of the world was about to occur. But then he hastily went on to explain that he had determined that this was probably a false alarm. And called me to see if I could help him figure out what had gone wrong with his computers. I was not able to do that. It took us, in fact, 3 days to determine that the sergeant had come on watch that night had mistakenly put into the computer, instead of the operating tape, it put in a training tape, which produced a very realistic scenario. Happily, the general was astute enough to determine there had been some error and did not send the alarm to Washington to wake the president at 3 in the morning and give him about 5 minutes to determine whether he should launch our missiles. This is the so-called launch on warning system, posed the great danger then that we might get into an accidental war, and that danger we brushed very close to a number of times. Today, unhappily, we still have that same launch on warning system. The president still has to make a decision if he gets an alert, whether to launch his ICBMs or to lose them if the attack was actually underway. This is a launch or lose concept. So
And I take it the launch on lose is the policy you would prefer? Are you favoring a launch on warning or?
Well, the reason we have launch on warning is that if we don't launch them, we will afraid we will lose them to the attack. That is, that the missiles that are coming in will be aimed at our missile silos. And therefore, if we do not launch them, we will lose them. The reason we have that problem is because once an ICBM has been launched, if we discover that it was an error, there's no way of recalling them, there's no way of disabling them. So that's a very dangerous situation. We had during the Cold War, we still have it today. So that danger is still with us. We also had during the Cold War the possibility of a war by miscalculation, of which the Cuban Missile Crisis is perhaps the poster child. I was also participated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was close enough to what was happening to understand just how dangerous it was. And I remember when I went into my office every day during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I truly believed it was going to be my last day on Earth. And to this day, I believe that we avoided a nuclear catastrophe during the Cuban Missile Crisis as much by good luck as by good management. The danger, the possibility of an accidental war is still with us today. It would not, there has to be some event, some precipitating event like the Cuban Missile Crisis to make it a danger. And today we have Russia with troops in the Ukraine. We have threats against the Baltics. And if the Russian troops were to go into the Baltics, which I do not believe they will, but if they were to, then they would be confronting NATO troops. And in that kind of an environment, it would be like the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would be an environment where we could blunder into a nuclear war. So those are the two ways we could have had a nuclear war during the Cold War, and they still exist today. Beyond that, we have two possibilities that did not exist during the Cold War, namely the possibility of a nuclear terror attack, which I would place as a relatively high probability among all these different events. And that, I think, is a very serious concern today, because if a terror group could get their hands even on fissile material, even without getting a bomb, if they could just get the fissile material, they would be able to make a bomb, nuclear bomb from that, and set it off in one of our cities with disastrous results. We recognize, our government, of course, recognizes this danger, and President Obama, to his great credit, started something called nuclear summits, of which there have been 4 now, in which 50 nations from around the world participated in devising and promising to take action on better ways of protecting the fissile material to keep them out of the hands of a nuclear terror group. So this is a danger today, and danger which we recognize we're trying to reduce the dangers of that. And finally, there is the possibility of a regional nuclear war, which didn't really exist during the Cold War, but now does today. And here the poster child would be India and Pakistan, each of which have more than 100 nuclear weapons, and each of which has had, and together they've had 3 or 4 wars, depending on how you count them, since the partition. And so there's always a danger that if they have another war, that this war could go now with nuclear weapons, that this war could now go nuclear. So those are the 4 great dangers we face today, and that is why I say that the danger the likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is actually greater than it was during the Cold War. And yet, our policies in no way recognize that. Our policies in no way and deal are compatible with those dangers. And I believe that's largely because our citizens are uninformed about what these dangers are, and therefore do not demanding that our political leaders take action to mitigate those dangers.
Thank you, Secretary Perry. You brought up a number of important topics. Let me turn to the question of terrorism. Senator Nunn, do you think that ISIS either has a radioactive dirty bomb or could get one?
Well, the question of whether ISIL has a bomb is not something I know the answer to, except they claimed at one point they claimed they did. But anytime you possess territory, certainly if it includes hospitals, you have the chance of getting radiological materials. You can determine what type material and so forth, but in most blood irradiators that in most big hospitals, including also children's hospitals, there is a shielded, because it's protected for the use of the personnel, cesium-137 that purifies the blood. So it has a very legitimate medicinal purpose, and it's very important. There now is new technology that can take the place of that, but cesium-137, if it was ever stolen by a terrorist group, could be used not to make a Hiroshima-type bomb, but a dirty bomb, taking conventional explosions, using radiological material, and you would deny access to a certain area. You would kill some people, not hundreds of thousands or anything like that, but you would deny access to an area if you use that particular type of material for 10 to 20 years. You'd have to tear down the whole structure. So in the middle of a city or a port, that could be extremely dangerous. So one of the things I think we've got to do, and this is one of the things I've been working on recently, both in Russia and here, is while we have this period of time, which I hope won't last forever, of great tension between the United States and Russia over Ukraine and over Syria and other things, I think it's important to rebuild at least a modicum of work together on preventing ISIL or any other terrorist or extremist group from getting radiological or any type of weapon of mass destruction, including chemical, biological, as well as nuclear.
Haven't you recommended a joint working group?
I've recommended a joint working group composed of Energy Department, there Rosatom, which is the equivalent of the Energy Department, and Intelligence. There is supposedly an awful lot of radiological material in Central Asia, near where ISIL operates. That would be dirty bomb type material. We could very much use the Russian cooperation there. I think this would be a bridge to get us back into working together, hopefully building trust that we had for about 15 years after the Cold War. We worked very successfully with the Russians, first of all, to get 3 countries to give up nuclear weapons. Ukraine gave them up, Belarus gave them up, Kazakhstan gave them up. Ukraine had more nuclear weapons than anybody but Russia and US. They had more than China or anyone else. Second, to gain control of nuclear materials. The good news is 50 countries after the Cold War that had highly enriched uranium, which is the principal ingredient a terrorist group would likely use to make a real nuclear weapon. We now have 24 countries. As Bill Perry said, President Obama's put the spotlight on this. George W. Bush had a program called Global Threat Reduction Initiative, and that program also brought back nuclear material. So we're doing work. It's not that we're not doing anything. It's the fact that US and Russia have 90% of all the nuclear weapons, 90% of the nuclear materials. We have a special obligation to work together. And I take the view, and I believe Bill would agree with this, that no matter what the differences we have with Russia, we've got to find ways to work with them in this area. This is vital. This is existential. It's also existential to them. Preventing any kind of war between the two of us, God forbid, is totally depending on, in my view, constant and continuous communication. When we totally distrust each other, it makes everything dangerous. It makes the people in the missile silos, or the people that are receiving warnings that could be false warnings, or the people who may have to determine if we've got a digital type cyber attack that instead of is giving us false warning. It makes that background material, that context, that environment between the two biggest nuclear powers is enormously important. So yes, I hope we can build this bridge, and I've been pushing this concept to get at least this limited type of cooperation back on the front burner.
Secretary Perry, the Obama administration has said that they're going to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years to renew our nuclear weapons. Is that a wise use of money?
No. I'll elaborate on that answer. We should not be rebuilding the nuclear weapons that we did during the Cold War. For one thing, the technical factors have changed dramatically since then. And for another, the geopolitical factors have changed since then. We're not now facing the Soviet Union. We're not, and technology has changed dramatically in terms of what we can do with our weapons. We also have highly superior conventional forces today. So the situation is completely different, and I think it would be a major mistake to just reproduce the nuclear arms race that we had during the Cold War. It not only would be enormously expensive, I don't know whether the $1 trillion is the right figure, but it's a very large figure, and that may be close to the right number. But it's a very large number, and so it's going to be very expensive. And I think equally importantly, if not more importantly, it's going to be dangerous. The Cold War nuclear arms race was dangerous. The arms race itself created its own set of dangers. And so we should really think very hard and very seriously before we embark on that program. I fully understand that Russia's embarked on, and well advanced actually, on rebuilding their nuclear arms. And so I realize that that puts pressure on us to take some actions, but I do not think there should be a reflexive action where we just go ahead and do what we've done before or do what the Russians are doing. In particular, I'm very concerned about the plan to rebuild our ICBM forces. As I mentioned before, the ICBMs have a unique danger associated with them. Namely, they're the system which lends itself to an accidental launch. Because they cannot be recalled, and because they could be targeted, they're fixed locations. And therefore, if we get a false alarm, we can sit it out with our submarine forces. We can launch our bomber forces, but they can be recalled. But we cannot, if we launch our ICBM forces, they cannot be recalled. And so there's a danger then from the ICBM forces. So if we go ahead at all with this complete rebuilding program, my judgment is it should be limited to the submarine forces and the bomber forces, and should let our ICBM forces phase out so we do not face that danger. During the Cold War, we maintained our ICBM forces, and at the time I believed our security demands that we do that. I do not believe that today, and I do not believe we need to take the risks that we took during the Cold War of an accidental nuclear war caused by our ICBM forces.
You've raised the question of the triad, Dr. Perry. Why not go even a step further and get rid of the bomber force, which is somewhat vulnerable? Instead of a triad, why don't we rely on our submarine-launched ballistic missiles?
The submarine-launched, our submarine force by itself is capable of being a powerful deterrent, very powerful deterrent. We maintain a bomber force in addition to that for two reasons. First of all, it gives us an insurance policy in the event that something would happen to our submarine force. I don't think that's likely, but it does give us that insurance policy. Beyond that, it has a complete recall capability, so it does not have the danger of the ICBM force, and it can be used and is used for conventional forces. So the bomber forces serve double duty. They not only strengthen our conventional forces, but they also provide an insurance policy in the event our submarine forces have developed some sort of a problem. Now, in the event of an alert, we have an attack underway, our bomber forces can leave the airfields and get in the air to avoid the attack. If indeed we believe that attack is imminent, we can even keep those bombers on airborne alert. But in any event, we can launch them in the face of an alert without the danger of starting an accidental war.
A few days ago, the New York Times reported that the Obama administration is moving towards smaller, less destructive nuclear weapons. What are the implications of that, Senator Nunn?
Well, we have varying sizes of weapons and always have had and must have, but I think it's a false premise to believe that we can build a small nuclear weapon, use that small nuclear weapon, and avoid escalation. I think once you cross the nuclear threshold, it's anybody's guess. I don't think anybody could predict that the reaction on the other side would be, hey, it's just a small weapon, it's the size of Hiroshima, don't worry about it. I think that once the President of the United States is asked by his military to give them the authority to use nuclear weapons, I think that is a fateful decision that any president would think long and hard about. And I think hopefully the Russians would also. One of the most dangerous things going on right now is that Pakistan is in a similar position to what we were in vis-a-vis the Soviet Union after World War II, the 50s and 60s, where we developed tactical, small battlefield nuclear weapons. We've been there and done that. And the reason we had them was to prevent the mobilization of tank armies. We were trying to deter the Soviets that had advantage over tank armies from ever mobilizing them, massing them, getting them together. We've taken, Herbert Walker Bush, after the Cold War, took away most of those weapons. But the Pakistanis are now doing that with their inventory. They're going to tactical nuclear weapons, and it means when you've got short-range nuclear weapons, even though they're very powerful, you have to use them at the very beginning of a conflict, or you have to back them up to get them out of the way if the enemy is coming across. That was the case with us and vis-a-vis the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. It's the case that Pakistan feels they are with India. That's an enormously dangerous situation. I think, for instance, I've told my Russian friends they still have a lot of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And I basically say to them, and I say to our Americans, we have some. We have most of ours aircraft delivered. I consider those basically prepositioned equipment for terrorists because the security of them is enormously important. And it takes a huge amount of personnel to guard and protect those weapons. So I think we have enough deterrent without them. I wish the Russians would get rid of them. One of these days they I think will, but that's not anytime soon. In the meantime, we have plenty of strategic weapons to, I think, deter that kind of conflict. And as Bill Perry already mentioned, the shoe's on the other foot now because we have the conventional advantage in most of the dimensions in Europe. We don't have it in countries like the Baltics because they're so close to the Russians. I think the other thing we've got to examine and think how we would react if it were happening to us, and that is what is the likely reaction of the Russians if we keep expanding our NATO forces right next to that border. It basically is an understandable reaction after Ukraine. All of our allies in the Baltics and others want us to basically be there. They want America to protect them. They want assurance that if the Russians invade, we'll go to war, including nuclear war. But I think we've got to think long and hard. And that's why I want to build this bridge of trust back with Russia. It'll be hard to do because they've done some things that are totally unacceptable to us, and they violated the sovereignty of Ukraine. But on the other hand, we have moved into a very dangerous era. I heard, Bill, you may have heard Henry Kissinger, he quoted a Chinese friend of his saying that the Ukrainian development was a lose, 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 lose situation. Ukraine lost Crimea, Russia lost Ukraine, the West lost Russia, and the world lost stability. And we've got to rebuild that. I think we have to insist the Russians keep their commitment with the Kyiv Agreement on Ukraine, but we also, in the meantime, have to recognize that we and Russia have an existential stake in each other's survival. Their warning systems, if their warning systems go wrong, we don't think about it very often, guess who gets hit? Us. Now, would it be small comfort to be able to know that we can retaliate? And that's deterrence. but both countries would be destroyed in any nuclear war. General Bradley said many years ago, the only way to win a nuclear war is to prevent one from ever happening. We and the Russians have to know that. Reagan and Gorbachev said that very clearly and loudly and many times. Nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. We've got to start. I hate to bring subjects like this up for the audiences because you've got plenty of other things to worry about, but we've got to understand that, and Russia has to understand it. And one of the things I suggested to our students that I met with a little while ago is that we begin, with all the modern communications, we begin dialogue between our young people here at the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech and other places, and the Russian young people, because the adults here are leaving our young people a world that is enormously dangerous.
There's something of a paradox. We have so many nuclear weapons around, even though they've been scaled back somewhat. And yet leaders all over the world, in this country, in Russia, talk about reducing the number of nuclear weapons to zero. How do you explain the paradox that we at least haven't gotten it down to the range of maybe 50 on each side, strategic weapons? Why do we still have so many?
I think we have too many, but one of the things that I think we need to focus on is not just numbers. I think we need to focus about survivability. I want the Russians to have survivable systems because I don't want them to feel like they've got to fire quickly if they get a false warning. I want us to have survivable weapons. So survivability and force posture is enormously important. What I have talked about in Russia and the United States for years, and so far it has not caught on, is we need to both try to increase the warning time. We need to give both our presidents, if they've got 5 minutes now to decide, I'd like them to have 10 minutes if they get a general coming in saying that they think a missile attack is coming. If they've got 10 minutes now, I'd like for them to have 30 minutes. If we can get it to 30 minutes, make it an hour, and then a day, and then a week. If you make nuclear weapons less relevant, that is the way to eventually get the numbers down. Simply reducing the numbers is not enough. You have to make them less relevant. You have to make them more survivable. If you put them all in one pile on both sides and had 100, you might make nuclear war more likely because they're vulnerable. So we have to think in those terms. That's the way the military has to think. And I think we've got to restore some of the thinking in both Russia and the United States, and increasingly China, on the whole question of stability. Not giving either side the feeling they have to fire quickly or lose their weapons. That's extremely dangerous world.
Secretary Perry, I wonder what you think is the most important priority for preventing a nuclear disaster. What's the most important thing we can do?
I have to divide that into two categories, two most important things, because of the different kinds of dangers. In the case of the danger of nuclear terrorism, the thing we are now doing on the nuclear summits is a very important, perhaps the most important thing we do, which is to get better control of the fissile material so the terrorists cannot get a bomb. But in the danger of an accidental war, or a war with Russia, for example, nuclear war with Russia, then what we most need to do is the thing which Senator Nunn was talking about, which is work seriously and diplomatically to try to get U.S.-Russia relations back on a positive basis again. And failing to do that, the least we can do is work cooperatively with Russia in areas which are obviously mutual concern, namely preventing nuclear terrorism, as Senator Nunn has proposed. So the minimum is working with Russia on this area of profound mutual interest, which is preventing mutual terrorism. But beyond that, we should be working to try to get back into a cooperative basis and many other things that we do as well. This antagonism between the United States and Russia today, to me, is the biggest factor that makes me concerned.
You talked about the importance of stability. Does the ballistic missile defense program we've been pursuing make it so that the Russians are afraid we're going for a first strike eventually?
I think anytime the Russians feel like the United States could attack them, and then with whatever forces they have to survive that will survive after we attack them, we could basically defend against most of them with missiles, defensive missiles. Yes, that's a real concern. We had that concern when I first came in to the movie, so to speak, in the Senate. One of the first briefings I've got was the Russian missile defense system around Moscow, and how destabilizing that was, because we felt that might entice them to think they could strike first and then defend against what's left. So I've always been convinced there was a place for missile defense. I've supported missile defense, but not in the sense of an Astrodome that protects you, but in the sense of accidental launch. As Bill said a few minutes ago, you shoot a missile off by mistake. There's a new movie coming out, Command and Control, that shows a missile being launched by accident in Nebraska. No, actually it was in Arkansas back in the 1980s, called Command and Control, coming out in the fall. And that missile didn't go anywhere. It was an accident. It went across the field, but the warhead was actually launched. And everybody who testified said that they basically didn't know whether it might go all the way. Well, if the President of the United States right now is told by one of his commanders, I'm sure the Russians are the same way, that they've just launched one by mistake and it's heading to Russia, what's he going to do? Pick up the phone and say, sorry, President Putin, got one coming. It's not intentional. We're not going to have any more. We shouldn't be in that position in these days and times. Our relationship, we're not fighting Russia over some kind of communist theory that they're going to take over the world anymore. This is more about nationalism and regionalism and so forth. So we ought to be able to sit down. This takes military to military conversations. It's going to take a lot of military to military conversations. But the political leaders have to mandate it. And so I think that's where we've got to head. I think we've got to move from mutual assured destruction, and this gets into regional and conventional also. It's not just nuclear. From mutual assured destruction to a sense of mutual understanding, to a sense of mutual warning, where we work on warning systems together, and where we have limited missile defense systems that don't threaten each other's deterrent but could protect against accidental or could protect against an Iranian launch or a North Korean launch. That's limited. That's not the same thing as threatening the whole question of shoot and then defend. That's a different equation.
Well, why don't we open this up to questions? We have Twitter feeds, as you know, and the hashtag is UGA Charter 16, and we're looking for questions from Georgia Tech as well, and from this audience. So are there any questions that have come in? Thank you. Dr. Perry, what is the likelihood that Russia withdraws from the CTBT? Does this put pressure on the U.S. to finally ratify the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty?
We signed the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, back in 1996, I believe it was, but failed to ratify it. And so the United States has not officially ratified that treaty. We have lived by it. We have not conducted any tests. We haven't ratified it. Most of the other nations of the world, including Russia, have ratified it. I think it's a very bad position for the United States to be in, because of all of the nations in the world, we are the ones that are best prepared to live with the Test Ban Treaty, and the ones who would have the most to lose if other nations tested. Now, what if Russia started testing a whole new generation of weapons? What if India and Pakistan broke out with more testing and started testing hydrogen bombs? And what if China broke out with testing again? All of those are actions which would adversely influence our national security. And therefore, I think it would be very imperative for us to not only live by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but actually to ratify it. Unfortunately, I don't see any political possibility of that happening anytime in the foreseeable future. So we need perhaps to find some other way of getting a universal ban on testing, perhaps by a resolution of the United Security Council, the United Nations Security Council.
Here's a question for Senator Nunn about radiological materials. We've touched on that earlier, particularly in Latin America where there are a number of non-state actors. Are you concerned about loose controls over those materials?
I'm concerned about radiological materials all over the world, and I think, frankly, it's miraculous we haven't had that kind of dirty bomb. Again, this is not a Hiroshima. This is taking conventional explosions, putting radiological material in it, dispersing it, and depending on the material, depending on what type it is, denying access to an area, which could cause billions of dollars worth of damage. But the other aspect I'm worried about, I think there'll be a lot of mass confusion about whether it's really a nuclear attack. I've told my friends in the civil nuclear power industry that they have a lot of stake in this too, because I think it would turn people, as Fukushima did in Japan, against nuclear power. I happen to think nuclear power as part of the overall energy equation, particularly given the global warming problems, is an indispensable part of it. So yes, I'm concerned about radiological all over the world because it's used all over the world. Used in industrial applications and very legitimate uses. And so we've all got to work on that.
And in hospitals, as you pointed out.
In hospitals, and I might have mentioned, but Emory University has now taken their cesium-137, they're going to get rid of it and substitute X-ray technology. Fortunately, in some of these areas, you can substitute technology that doesn't have these dangers, and that's the direction we have to go in.
Are there questions from the floor? Yes, straight back.
Israel and our allies in the Middle East, do we know how many nukes they have, what their capability is?
Does Israel have nuclear weapons? How many? What are their capabilities?
Israel doesn't comment on that. They neither confirm nor deny. All the information I would have read over my period of involvement in this arena would indicate they have a rather capable nuclear capability, and that's something that all the public information says, and I have no reason to have any contrary thoughts. I can't directly confirm it, but I certainly believe the publications that have publicly said that for many years. They've had nuclear capability for many years. On our NTI board, we've got a fellow named Gideon Frank, who's one of their nuclear experts. And we also have the former Russian foreign minister, Igor Ivanov, and we've got some Chinese. So we're trying to bring together people from all over the world. And that's what I'm suggesting also needs to happen with young people, with our communication. So I would think Israel would certainly be listed on anybody's list as one of the 9 countries that has nuclear capability.
Secretary Perry, I wonder if you could comment on the question of the nuclear risk reduction centers that you and Senator Nunn have worked on. Can you tell us about those?
He's on video. He's on a video. I'll come out.
One of the principal ideas of the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center
Okay.
is to
I hope that's not a terrorist sneaking into your office.
allow each nation to understand what the other nation is thinking and planning to do so we can avoid blundering into some kind of a nuclear war. That's the risk that we are reducing in the nuclear risk reduction centers. Better communication.
That was started back, Senator Warner and I sponsored that back in the early days of Gorbachev. And there was Reagan and Gorbachev. We presented it to Reagan. Arnold may remember we had a sheet of paper and we talked, this was 1987, 1988. And the first half of the sheet of paper was about setting up better communications, not simply the red button, but also emergency communications. And the second half was about preventing nuclear terrorism and working together. That was in the Soviet days. And Bud McFarlane was President Reagan's national security advisor. He presented it to President Reagan before Warren and I went on a trip to Russia and came back and said, President Reagan agrees with the first half. You can tell President Gorbachev that. And we did. They agreed to the first half. The second half is still what we're talking about today.
Another student from a question, and then I'll come out to you. The student from the question from Twitter is, Why is it the United States, the Senate in particular, has failed to approve the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty?
I wasn't in the Senate at the time. In my view, it got boxed up in a procedural situation where the Democratic majority agreed with a unanimous consent request that they were going to have a time certain for a vote, which was a very bad mistake because they didn't have the votes. And normally you would not vote something down like that. You would simply postpone it. I don't think there was sufficient understanding. I don't think a lot of senators were prepared to vote on it. It got voted down. I believe that was 1998. Since that time, they've not been able to rebuild that kind of support. A lot of things have changed, right? We've had a comprehensive test ban organization that has put monitors in all over the world so we can detect tests. So the ability to detect cheating now is vastly superior to what it was when that vote was taken. So the hope is at some point the Senate will take it back up. I would agree with what Bill said. I think we'd be in a much stronger position because we've tested more than anybody by far. And we would be a lot better off if we do not have testing, which would lead other countries to develop more and more sophisticated weapons, smaller weapons. That's why we worry about North Korea right now. It's not so much we worry about the big weapons as we worry about the small ones that can therefore be delivered because they have less weight on a missile all the way across to hit our own country. So it's not simply worrying about the big bang. We worry about the small, sophisticated weapons, which is what testing leads to. And so we are much better off in the United States if we agree to that kind of treaty and then make sure it's enforced. And the earlier question about Russia, if they do develop a new warhead, then their scientists, like ours would, will ask that it be tested because they won't know about it as to whether it actually would work. It's always curious to me that you got thousands and thousands of weapons and you're worried about somebody figuring out on the other side that one of them won't work, or I don't sense that danger. But if you had a whole series of failures of weapons, then it could weaken deterrence.
Remember, Dean Russ, you said both sides would press the red button during the Cold War and nothing would happen. They wouldn't work. Yes.
At the beginning of the lecture, we made this assessment that in the next 71 years, you felt that there was more of a risk of a nuclear threat than the previous, I think, 70 years that we discussed. A lot of the rhetoric about nuclear threats is suggesting that it would come from, I guess, a non-state actor or kind of a rogue group. And given that these groups have limited access to resources and kind of their inability to spend time on research and development, do you think it's possible that we're overestimating or kind of over-exaggerating the nature of a nuclear threat in this day and age?
My own view is I hope we are, because I'd much rather over-exaggerate it and do something about it than underestimate it and not take action. But we know that the nuclear technology is out there. We know people can dial up on the internet and figure out how to make a crude weapon. It wouldn't be a piece of cake. I don't want to make anybody believe it would be easy, but there are lots and lots of people that could build those weapons now around the globe if they have the nuclear material. It would not be a weapon that would be mounted on a missile likely or an airplane and delivered through space or through the air. It would be a crude weapon, probably a very large, unsophisticated one that would be in the back of a truck. I don't worry nearly as much about missiles coming from a known address on a deliberate attack as I do a group getting that kind of material, building a crude weapon, not having a return address, pulling a truck into a major city somewhere in the world and blowing up. It might not work perfectly, but you still would have a nuclear detonation. That's my concern. I'm like Bill. I don't think countries that are rational would deliberately launch nuclear weapons knowing that we would immediately know where they came from. But I do worry a great deal about it. So it's not the most probable type of weapon of mass destruction attack, that is a missile or even a truck bomb. It's the most consequential. It's the most consequential. And a terrorist organization, if a weapon was set off in one city, you know that some organizations would claim they had 3 or 4 more bombs in other cities. So what it would do to the world economy, even one weapon, even if it didn't work perfectly, would be, in my view, very destabilizing to the whole economy and the confidence. You can imagine if there was a weapon that went off and killed even 40, 50,000 people, whatever, a very small burst. What would happen if there was announced right after that there were 5 or 6 more in cities around the world? Guess which cities? The abandonment of cities would be something to behold. You hate to think about these things. I know it's not a pleasant thought. You'll be ready to get back to Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Hillary Clinton.
Senator Nunn has referred to a return address in a sense. Secretary Perry, could you comment on the problem of nuclear attribution? Are you confident that we would know who hit us if we were hit by a nuclear weapon?
No, I'm not. We have put a lot of effort into that, a lot of study on how to do that. In some countries, I think we might be able to because we had some background information on their nuclear weapons. But in general, the attribution is a very tricky business in which you cannot have complete confidence. Even if we could attribute, then there's a question, what do we do about it? Suppose we had a terrible bomb go off in one of our cities, and suppose we were able to attribute it as having come from a Russian weapon. What do we do about that? Perhaps the Russian weapon had been stolen from one of their facilities by a terror group and set off. Do we bomb Moscow? I mean, the attribution question is, first of all, difficult to be confident of, and secondly, difficult to know what to do with it, even if you had it.
We have a minute or so left for each of you to offer a parting thought, if you'd like. Senator Nunn?
Well, you know, we worked with the Russians for 15 years after the Soviet Union broke up. At one point in time, we had a 15-year agreement to buy their low-enriched uranium, which came from highly enriched uranium, which had been in bombs and missiles aimed at us. This just expired 2 years ago. So for about 15 years, 1/10 of all the electricity in our country was coming from nuclear power that was being driven by low-enriched uranium converted into nuclear fuel. That was swords into plowshares. I think that we can work with them. We have an existential stake. We have to. We also have to work with China. I would close with something I've already said. We're in a new era. We're in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. We've got to find ways to build bridges, even with countries we don't agree with. And we've got to work together to prevent proliferation. And we've got to work together to prevent terrorism, particularly nuclear terrorism.
Thank you. Secretary Perry.
I said at the beginning that our policies are not adequate for the dangers we face because people don't understand those dangers. And therefore, my message to you would be, to each of you in this audience, would be get yourself educated on these problems and spread the education around you to other people. Some of you are teachers, students. You can get educated and you can get the public to understand these dangers so that our policies can become much more compatible with the kind of dangers we actually face. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time has expired. I would like to thank Provost Whitten and President Moorhead for supporting this wonderful event, and also Dean Lindquist of SPIA. I'd like to thank as well Med Amstadt and Katie Veit for organizing this whole affair. For the able staff of SPIA, Sarah Baines, Lauren Ledbetter, and Nancy Thompson for all of its good work behind the scenes. Olivia Vasilati, who kindly brought me some questions, thank you. And our friends and colleagues at Georgia Tech who have been listening in, we thank them for their participation. The outstanding technical team, which has allowed all this electronic wizardry to actually take place. Valeria McPhail, Senator Nunn's Chief of Staff, who gave us sure-handed guidance, which we appreciated. And above all, of course, Senator Nunn and Secretary Perry for all their wonderful insights today. Thank you so much.
One footnote, the University of Georgia has done a great deal of work in export controls on nuclear materials, on non-proliferation of nuclear materials. Gary Birch may be somewhere in the audience, and his team of people, there he is right there. Gary is one of the people known in this country and all over the world for the work that's been done right here.
Gary, would you kindly stand up just for a moment?